It's safe to say that Avengers Endgame is one massive movie that's surpassing all of the records out there, and it seems that it may even beat Avatar for the all-time highest grossing movie ever. This is an outstanding phenomenon that may be the first of its kind because, well, you see, Endgame is a movie with a big entry barrier and many prerequisites to be able to enjoy to the fullest, as this film is not only a sequel to Infinity War, but it also takes some cues and concepts from many other movies that came along before. That, in theory, would make the movie a hard seller because of all of that continuity that came before. But actually, Marvel made a smart move. We all knew that ever since they released the first Avengers movie in 2012, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was forging itself as a filmic space united by the same characters and ongoing plot threads that would eventually collapse and merge, but everyone was doing its things in different movies. So you may even say that little by little the MCU got us used to the intertwining plot threads in between its movies. But this concept of a universe inhabited by different fictional characters, each with its own stories and worlds, it's really not something new in the world of comics. In fact, it was in the 60s when Barry Allen Flash met Jay Garrick Flash in a story known as The Flash of Two Worlds. In that story, creators Gardner Fox, Julius Schwartz and Carmine Infantino managed to mix perfectly the original Golden Age Flash with its newer counterpart, the Silver Age Flash. It didn't pass much time for Marvel, guided by Stan the Man Lee and his frequent partners like Kirby and Ditko, to design their world with that same concept in mind: the convergence of superhero stories and events in different points of fictional time, all throughout a mutable timeline of past, present and future. That is what's known as continuity and more or less canon in the comics. Things that happen in the Avengers comics have repercussions in other comics where the same characters appear, even if it's an incident that didn't happen in a mega event or crossover. One of the biggest barriers or problems to start reading comics, especially superhero comics that have existed for more than 80 years, like Superman, the first superhero, or even Batman, the most well-known vigilante, is precisely the huge amount of history and backlog stories of those characters. There are some times where creators invent new concepts for the stories and characters, but other times they grab old story concepts and elements to give them a newer and fresher spin or point of view, making that particular old story relevant again. In fact, given the many generations that grew up immersed in superhero comics, there are plenty of cases where people who started as fans return full circle to become the new creators and storytellers of those heroes. The problem here is the fact that not even the most obsessed fan can possibly know every small detail of the life and work of a fictional character, even worse when those characters appear in other books aside their own title. Even editors sometimes have a hard time to know what is actually happening with said superheroes. So there are some extreme cases where there is no other option but to cut everything and start again. In the 80s, DC Comics saw no other alternative but to organize a catastrophic mega event that would course correct their entire continuity. This apocalyptic saga was aptly called Crisis in Infinite Earths, and its main purpose was to unify their continuity and shared universes into one sort of cohesive universe and story, to try and bring order and sense to all of their stories that have had existed since the 40s. There were so many versions of their characters that it was almost impossible to know what were their actual power sets and where was their original Earth. From that point on, DC's continuity became a little bit more manageable and simple, to a certain extent, because there were some characters that still remembered, and well, actually outside the DC universe, in our world, people still remembered what happened before, and some even yearned for the return of the mega multiverse. So little by little, things returned to how they were, albeit in a more controlled fashion. On the other hand, Marvel has never ever done a complete continuity reboot, in theory. Before Secret Wars, and I'm talking about the 2015 Hickman and Rivik mega event, the Marvel multiverse more or less kept itself relevant and fresh and ordered by using the concept of the sliding continuity window. That narrative tool allowed that the origin stories of the characters remained more or less the same. It just revamped the time when it happened. But, as with everything, it came a point where it was kind of impossible to know what was happening. In particular, the X-Men suffered a lot because of a super epic, but at the same time super confusing 16-year run of author Chris Claremont and many illustrators. In Claremont's stories, every new character that was introduced was a future child of someone, a clone of someone, the mind of someone in the body of some other, a time traveler, the child of someone but from a parallel dimension, or, well, you know, ordinary X-Men stuff. It was so hard to know what was happening that not even the Great Apocalypse and his Age of Apocalypse could sort things out. Grant Morrison had to come and kill almost everyone in his saga E is for Extinction, and then Bendis continued with his No More Mutants to more or less make sense of their confusing continuity. So you can really say that continuity is a double-edged sword, since it can create loyal fans that are willing to read everything to know every detail of the heroes, but it can also create a tremendous fear for newer audience, since they may believe that they have to read every comic ever to grasp the overall story. And well, to be clear, comics don't work like that. They are not completely serialized in a sense that not every story builds upon the previous one. For example, Detective Comics number 1000 probably has nothing to do with Detective Comics number 700. I mean, they probably both have Batman as a protagonist and he may be doing the same sort of thing, but the stories are not directly related. Comics are divided in arcs, and there are some times where the previous arc does bleed into the next, but for the most time, arcs remain fairly standalone. And when you really need some previous knowledge, editors make an effort to explain in a simple manner what's happening, and they even guide you to the comic where that element played out. So there are more or less two numbering systems in comics. The number of the comic, you know, Action Comics number 1004, Uncanny X-Men 743, etc. And the number corresponding to the part of the arc. And on average, the internal arcs more or less play out in 6 parts. So don't worry, it's not that hard to get into comics. Back to Avengers Endgame, this is a movie that doesn't carry the number 2 in its title to suggest that it's a direct sequel to Infinity War, or the number 4 to tell the times that we've seen together the Avengers on the silver screen. Even though there is no numeric indicator, the film is pretty impossible to watch without the previous knowledge of more or less 8 or so movies of the MCU. And yet, this is the highest grossing movie from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Does this mean that pop culture is now ready for extensive stories with dense continuities? Not at all. Yet, we can see that Endgame uses to its favor the condensed continuity of the movies, the worldwide interest in the mega crossovers of Marvel Comics, and it even uses pop culture reference to draw in more people instead of scaring them away. A while ago, I saw a video where Patrick H. Willems, a fantastic YouTube creator, talked that the problems with the MCU is that the movies go from one event to the other without giving us the more intimate moments where the characters are trying to get used to the new status quo that came with the previous mega event. He comments that that's exactly what the MCU is missing, a little bit of downtime where we can know more about those characters and their motivations, even develop feelings for them up until the next mega event happens and everything changes again. And as a comic book reader myself, I agree with him. Yet, I don't think that the rest of the audience are willing to see the more quiet moments of Hawkeye or even the sciencey parts of Spider-Man and Iron Man. I think that contrary to us readers, the general moviegoer audience just wants to see the mega super events that happen in the Avengers, and so maybe standalone series like the ones of Disney Plus will give us the downtime moments that some of us crave, but I don't think that they are going to be as massive as the movies. With that said, we can clearly see that this new type of simplified movie continuity is kind of a thing. This new condensed continuity of the MCU, a continuity created entirely by the mega Marvelite events with some origin stories here and there, is actually very appealing to the masses. Each new movie advances the stories of the most well-known characters, and it gives a starting point to newer characters to be explored in different movies to then be united in the mega event movies called, up until now, Avengers. And it's a very curious thing because if you take a moment to check, the MCU is made up of many movies, but they are actually minuscule if you compare them to the dozens and hundreds of comics that exist inside the shared universe of the comic book sagas. To be exact, the Marvel Cinematic Universe up until the Infinity Stone saga is comprised by 22 movies that started more or less in 2008. Yet the creators, in this case being all the producers, directors, actors, screenwriters, etc., have intertwined very well the individual and group stories that make the MCU feel like a tapestry that's very rich and complex, but at the same time very simple to approach. In February of 2014, Kevin Feige, who can now possibly be the filmic equivalent of Stan Lee, declared that Marvel Studios wanted to imitate the rhythm that the comic books have developed by making characters appear in their own movies and then join together for the big events that culminate in Avengers movie. As a matter of fact, those Avengers movies are the singularities that more or less mark the end and the start of the Marvel phases. Feige also stated that it's about teaching the audience about the notion that all the characters exist on their own, they may get together for specific events, and when that is over, each and every one of them still exists in their own world and story. Just as comic book readers have been used to that from the decades and decades of stories, people are now accepting that there is a moment for the Avengers to be together and the rest of the time they may be alone. It's incredible to think that everything really started in Iron Man, with that innocent but now fateful post-credit scene where we see that S.H.I.E.L.D. director Nick Fury goes to Tony Stark's mansion to tell him that Iron Man is not the only superhero in the world, paving the way for the Avenger Initiative. That small post-credit scene became the most powerful weapon of the MCU to be able to extend its movies, leaving you wanting to know more about the fictional story and continuity that exists in the character's extended universe. It's really futile to try and compare the narrative structures and continuity of some comics with the narrative sequence and condensed continuity of some movies. What originally started as adaptations of the most well-known comic book sagas has now transformed and mutated into something new and unique, and is telling modern stories about characters that have been around for more than 50 years without needing to look back to where they came from. And that is actually perfect. The condensed continuity of the MCU works because it gives us the most important parts of the new sagas of those characters. It grabs the concepts that work in comic book format and modifies them to make them relevant and interesting for a film that lasts roughly 2 hours, not for a story that will be told in about 120 pages that will finish in about 6 months or so. It has been told that comic writers and illustrators, limited by the inherent two-dimensional quality of the medium, only portray the most interesting panels and words in the pages, and with their eyes and imagination we enable the flow of time and fill out the rest. The MCU more or less does the same thing, but in a 3D way. The movies portray the most interesting moments of the character's life and adds rhythm and movement to those events. And for the newer generations that want everything immediately and now, the MCU has proven to be the best way to introduce all of those characters that were born almost 50 years ago and that will surely continue to be present in modern and future pop culture. It's incredible that a movie with so many prerequisites to fully understand its plot has nearly become the highest grossing movie ever. But at the same time, it's really not so surprising. The creators were very careful of the universe since its creation with Iron Man and took the time to make it better and better. After the abrupt change of the actor that played War Machine, the new contracts also included clauses that allowed Marvel Studios to use up to 3 minutes of character footage from one movie to another, something that's known as bridging material. You may actually not like all of the 22 movies to date, but you probably watched and even rewatched the required ones to be able to fully understand the plot threads of Avengers Endgame, because most likely no one has the time and energy to read 20 or more comics to understand the newest Avengers saga, but certainly everyone has 10 or less hours to get up to date with Captain America's or Thor's or even the Guardians' whereabouts before Endgame. The MCU made continuity accessible, and that paid off greatly. By creating a simpler storyline and a condensed continuity, Marvel gave us one of the greatest sagas of modern times that reached its peak with Endgame and concluded in a spectacular and epic way that, if it was really the last movie, probably no one would complain. But of course, we all know that that won't happen since they just opened the gates to the multiverse with the new Spider-Man movie. So we'll obviously have more stories and more continuity from Marvel, and we can probably be sure that in the future, the next Avengers movie, one that will hopefully have a version of the lineup of the new Avengers with Wolverine and Bucky, or even more wild with Reed Richards, Namor and or Xavier, be the next ode to the still not born multiversal condensed continuity. Just as Endgame was for this saga of 22 movies, 11 years, dozens of characters, 6 original Avengers, and the one and only Iron Man.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
I enjoyed greatly the finale of the Avengers saga. I had to get a little bit dehydrated to be able to watch the movie without interruptions, but it was totally worth it. Is it a perfect movie? No. Is it a worthy conclusion for the saga? Definitely. The movie is able to deliver a satisfying conclusion to all of the stories of the original Avengers and purposely leaves certain things in the air. The movie is very entertaining, and if you're a moviegoer that has grown up with the Marvel films, well, then there is no entry barrier to be able to enjoy it to the fullest. I purposely didn't enter heavy spoiler territory because the movie is totally self-explanatory, so the best experience is to go and see the movie and enjoy it by itself. It's really an awesome experience full of epic, sad and badass moments. And if you ask me, I really can't wait for Kevin Feige to introduce the X-Men and the Fantastic Four to the MCU. But as we already know, it will not happen anytime soon. My name is Absa, and if you want to continue the conversation about comics and anime, you can follow me on Twitter, where I tweet in English and Spanish, and also on Instagram, where I upload pics of some of my cats and my figures, and sometimes even myself. This is a new channel where I'll be going to talk about anime, comics and even some figure reviews, mostly Tamashii Nations and some Gunpla. So I invite you to subscribe to this channel and, as per the YouTube algorithm, click on the notification icon to check out every video that I upload. Thank you very much for staying to the end of the video, and without anything more to add, see you soon.